Jon, first of all, welcome to the Sharpen podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. It's
Yeah.
what a joy to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so pleased to have met you and to get to have you on. And I would love for you to tell our audience about who you are, and we'll also talk about the work that you do.
Yeah, well, Kirby, I grew up in a small town in the middle of the state of Minnesota. It's really cold there, but there's also a lot of other cool things about Minnesota. I'm a huge fan of the state. We don't want to get too far into that, but Minnesota's a great place. I kind of like grew up with a very Midwestern upbringing. My dad was a teacher. My mom was a nurse. They took me to church when I was young, and that was an important thing to me. I think I started to adopt some of the ideas of Christianity at an early age. And the other thing I really loved was business. So I always wondered what was the intersection of like my faith with business. For some reason, I remember looking back, my church, for example, they would kind of invite missionaries to come up on stage and share what they were doing, and then they'd pray for them and commission them and help raise money for them. And I always kind of wondered, like, why don't we commission the business people, or why don't we
Mm.
commission the teachers or the doctors to go do that? Because isn't that work just as important? And can't that work be just as missional as kind of going to a traditional missions field? And so I kind of set out from a fairly early age. And again, it's kind of wild to me looking back that God was trying to connect those dots for me at such an early age. But I set out to try and understand what my faith had to say about what I should do in the business world, because I really wanted to do business. And so I went to college at the University of Minnesota and met a couple of other Christians there. And we actually two of my friends started a Christian business group where we started to have these conversations. And that has kind of led to a long journey for me of really exploring the questions of what does a Christian faith have to do with what we make of the world, and specifically what role does business play in what happens in the world.
Yeah,
So
talk about that college group there. So we have some college listeners on Sharpen, especially those that are like junior, senior year. I can imagine what you just said. They're like, wait a minute, he just started something in college. There was a gap, and you filled it. But can you talk a little bit about that and that group and kind of what the intention was and how you all got started?
yeah. So the caveat to that story is I did not start it. It was a couple of friends of mine, but they were like looping me in as they were doing it. I was um, yeah, it was just, it's so interesting to me how some people just have that entrepreneurial itch and they're just like, well, if it doesn't exist, let's just start it.
Right.
And I've always been around a lot of those people and I've kind of come along for the journey, but I'm often not the one to initiate the thing. I'm like the one who kind of helps join it and start with them. So it's two of my friends, and they kind of had this idea to start a conversation around what it meant for us to be Christian and in the marketplace. The group had what I would say, I would lovingly critique it now and say that it had a terrible name.
Oh
It had
gosh.
a terrible name
What was it?
that I would really like to change. It's called Truth in Business, which is so kind of arrogant and naive that it like suggests that we, the Christians, are the only one that really know the truth about business or something
Right.
like, oh man, it's kind of like cultural arrogance as Christians. But anyway, that's what it was called. Wonderful group of young people. If nothing else, it just helped you identify who the other Christians were in the
Yeah.
business program at a large school. But we invited speakers to come in and share their stories of working in the marketplace. And it was a good group because I met a bunch of other Christians. Many of them I'm still in touch with, and we had some thoughtful conversations. The one thing that I would say, in addition to my loving critique of the name, is the theology of most of the people who came was primarily like what I would now call a half gospel theology of faith and work.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that, Kirby, is the overarching narrative was, what does it mean to be a Christian in the marketplace? Well, be nice to people, never do anything immoral. If a coworker is going through a hard time, maybe you could pray for them or maybe even invite them to church. It was Minnesota also, so we offered to bake them a hot dish. Um, and and then we should make money and give it to the church, give it to missions, give it to the church, things like that. And maybe we volunteer and do Sunday school or something like that. That was the overarching narrative about what it meant to be a Christian in the marketplace. Um, all of those things are good. We should do all of those things. But the gospel doesn't primarily call us to just be ethical, good people in the world. It actually calls us to go beyond that and figure out how to be redemptive in the world. And that's why the work that I have now, the work that I get to do at Praxis, and the kind of overarching theology, this idea of redemptive entrepreneurship, really goes a lot beyond that kind of like, let's just try to be nice Christians and never do anything immoral. And like, let's be known for that. It's like, no, let's be known for our love and our sacrifice and the way that we follow Jesus into sacrificing for the good of other people in the world. And when I say something like that, people primarily think of like the nonprofit sector, but we have to get really creative and innovative to figure out how to do that in the for-profit sector, which is a lot of what I get to do in my work now at Praxis.
Cool. Cool. Hey, I am so excited that you mentioned Praxis. So we've had on Keaton Hendricks before, and he shared with us about starting a business in college. Jon, it was super cool. He had like pictures of his dorm room with like all of the socks and the shoes everywhere. And so he had a really neat message around, you're in college and this could be a really neat time to start something good. And he mentioned Praxis briefly, but for an audience that has never heard of Praxis before, you mentioned the work that you guys do, but just start us there and maybe even get us a little background of how did the I'll say organization, for lack of better words, come about.
Yeah, well, first, I want to just double down on what Keaton said. It is starting something in college is one of the best things you could possibly do because your overhead is taken care of, right? Like
Right.
you've got to pay the rent anyway, like and it's a pretty low risk environment. And as a college student, there's a ton of people that want to help you. There's business people that once you're out of college would like, it's really hard to get on their calendar and get a meeting with them. But if you say, hey, I'm a college student who's starting something, man, business people, they just want to help like in so many ways and they're willing to take meetings. So as soon as you graduate, for some reason, they're like really resistant. It's super hard to get on the calendar. When you're a college student, everyone wants to help you. Anyway,
I love it. Yeah.
and I love Keaton's story. And it's not necessarily like whatever you start in college is going to, like with Keaton, his thing turned into a full-time gig after college. I think most people should just do it for the experience of it, to learn how to be entrepreneurial and what it takes, because it's going to help you no matter what you decide to end up going to do. So anyway, a little bit of an aside, but I felt like I had to get it in there.
It was there. It was appropriate.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, I don't mean to be rebellious of your questions, like one of those guests that just kind of says whatever he wants to say, and you're like, that's not what I asked you.
Don't worry, we just edit those guests out, I'm just kidding.
That's good. Well, you edit me all that you want. Edit me all that you want. So Praxis is what we would describe it as a kind of a creative engine, and our whole thing is advancing this idea of redemptive entrepreneurship. And redemptive entrepreneurship, fundamentally, we would define it as sorry about that. Let me I'll start kind of from the beginning so you can cut it easily.
No, you're good. You're good.
I just like a little parched here.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good. Take your time.
So redemptive entrepreneurship, we would define as this idea of creatively restoring something that's broken in the world through sacrifice, creative restoration through sacrifice. Redemptive entrepreneurship applies if you're starting a nonprofit, a social enterprise, or a business. And no matter what sector you're in, this idea applies to what you're doing. And so we work with entrepreneurs who are trying to be redemptive in their field. We run a couple of startup accelerators. We look for 12 of the most innovative businesses every year and bring them into an accelerator, help mentor them, give them access to capital, help refine what they do. And then 12 nonprofits a year in the accelerator as well. We were running these accelerators for a couple of years, and we really heard from the fellows, that we call them Praxis fellows, who have been through an accelerator. They just said, wow, I wish this was around when I was in college, because my ideas, not only of how to start something, were being formed, but more importantly, what it meant to be a Christian and how to integrate my faith with what I do. That's when it's kind of one of the most formative times in your life for figuring that stuff out. Sure. And this was a new way of thinking that most fellows had never seen or heard before they came across Praxis. And so we, a couple of years into us starting Praxis, which is primarily running these startup accelerators, we began something called Praxis Academy, which was aimed toward college students to help educate them in that formative stage of life around these ideas of redemptive entrepreneurship. And so, and I would say on the academy side, one of the things we do is we run a week-long event every summer where we gather a group of what we call creatives, innovators, and entrepreneurs. So you don't have to be a current entrepreneur, but somebody who's innovative and creative in the way that you think and want to go about living and expressing your faith to the world. That group, we gather a large group of them every summer and kind of put them through a week-long intensive. They get to meet a lot of great people and be mentored and hear new ideas and connect with one another. And we think some of the connections that happen there may even lead to future companies that get started together starting at that event. So
yeah, for sure. So what are some of the key themes? So I'm thinking about our folks that listen to the podcast. Some would like to start a business. Some are, nope, I will run the business for you, et cetera, et cetera. But what are some of those key themes that come up that for all of us are just really important to keep on the forefront? Obviously, we want to talk a little bit more about the Academy in a little bit and how folks can learn more. But is there anything that you would just I guess for this audience focus on that you're like, these are the things that we talk about, and that is why it's a transformational experience?
Yeah, well, the first thing that we talk about is this idea of the kind of the full gospel narrative and how that should inform our theology of work. And theology is kind of a fancy word that I'm no theologian by any means. I'm a practical theologian, if anything. So the whole idea there is that work was actually around before the fall. And we often think of work primarily as toil and, it's just hard and, that's what it's going to be. But work and creativity was there in Genesis before sin entered the world. Sin enters the world, work does become toil. But then Jesus enters the picture. He's our salvation. And it doesn't stop there. Jesus isn't just a fire insurance policy to get us to heaven one day when we pass away. He's actually the reason and an animator for what we should do in the here and now. And what he's doing, God, in the grand scheme of things, is renewing all things back to the way that they ought to be. He's renewing all things. So his invitation to us is to participate in his redemption and renewal, her restoration of all things. And so when we start things and when we work in the world, our primary role is to join God in his renewal. And so think of it this way. If you're in education, you can ask the question, how can I join God in the renewal or the restoration of education? That could be as a teacher. That could be as a principal. It could be as somebody who is an entrepreneur who's starting an education technology startup. So it kind of applies broadly, the idea of redemptive work and joining God and redeeming things in the world. That's kind of a call for all of us to do. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. The audience, and I think you've mentioned this, and I do appreciate you calling that out, is that not everyone is going to be an entrepreneur. I know that right now, gosh, I can barely open LinkedIn without there being, an article, and especially among the audience that's listening to Sharpen, that the thought is that, oh, everyone from this generation is going to be an entrepreneur. Well, that's not the case. We have many gifted teachers and nurses and moms and dads, and the list that goes on, right, of all the roles that those folks take on in their life. So I think that to call out to be engaged in redemptive work doesn't necessarily look one way, but I appreciate the practical theology you walked us through. I would love to hear, I can imagine that the stories are endless, right? Like you could probably open your email inbox of the work that the fellows, and by the way, Jon, in Kentucky, like I'm really glad you clarified fellows, because that's very normal to be like, hey, fellas. So if you take off the OWS and just add on an A, that's a greeting in Kentucky. So there you go. Sure, fun fact, fellas. But for our audience today, could you just share some of those just stories that you've been a part of or that you've learned of because of the work through Praxis. And it might even just be like, well, let me tell you about one individual or one company. I know that sometimes the stories can really capture the work better than any website or anything else, right?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was just um, I was the same thing. I was scrolling through LinkedIn, and I don't know that anybody scrolls through LinkedIn. You get a notification, you go on there, and then you're bombarded with a bunch of
So
things.
true.
But but at the top of my feed was a post from a Praxis fellow who had just been through our startup accelerator, and he's standing in the house, the sort of House of Commons or whatever in the state of Pennsylvania, and he's standing next to a guy who had just been elected to the state House of Representatives for the state of Pennsylvania. He's 25 years old. He's the youngest ever elected member of the House in that state. And of course, we know Pennsylvania is a pretty historic place for a lot of reasons. But this young man, Jonathan Hershey, graduated from Messiah College a couple of years ago. And he came through our academy in the summer. So he was interested in politics, but only through the work of one of his peers who had come to our academy the previous summer could he be convinced that somebody interested in politics should go to an event about entrepreneurship. He's like, no, I'm interested in kind of politics and that sort of thing. Why would I go to an entrepreneurship event? And this guy Dylan, who was a big advocate, he's like, Jonathan, you've got to come, because really this is about an entrepreneurial way of thinking. It's not just being the pure word entrepreneurship. It's on thinking entrepreneurial and thinking redemptively about how we go about doing our work in the world. And so yeah, Jonathan, just in the comment on there, he said, Praxis helped lead me on this entrepreneurial journey. And part of what he would describe as his entrepreneurial journey, as I was reading it anyway, is running for state Senate or state House of Representatives was an entrepreneurial journey. To run a
Yeah,
campaign is an
for
entrepreneurial
sure.
activity. So, so anyway, it was just cool to me. This is the story that just came across like in the last couple of days that I saw this, and it's just kind of double down affirmation that the idea of being an entrepreneur should not be seen as, oh, I'm not an entrepreneur. It's all of us have an opportunity to think entrepreneurial. All of us have kind of a call to figure out how to be redemptive in the type of work that we care about doing.
That's so good. That's so good. Well, our audience here, as I mentioned, we've got a variety of folks. Some that are in college, and some that are in we'll say the first 10 years of the marketplace, of the whatever the workplace looks like. As you look back, I know you mentioned, I grew up in Minnesota and then I transitioned. I have to say it like that, right? For it to be Minnesota.
Minnesota. Yep.
Okay, good. And talk about your college experience and beyond. I mean, what's one thing we love to hear about is your experiences as a young professional yourself. So as you think about not only the young people that you work with, but your own career, your own life, what would you say, in conjunction, of course, with pursue work that is redemptive in nature? What are some other thoughts, ideas, any wisdom that you would offer us today?
Yeah, I think one overarching theme for me has been, and not just for me, but I see this in a lot of the entrepreneurs that I meet, is they operate at this intersection. Excuse me.
You're good.
So one overarching theme that I see with a lot of the entrepreneurs I meet is they operate at this intersection of seeing a major problem in the world, and maybe not even major, but like seeing a problem in the world that they care about solving, and then building a skill set that can make a meaningful contribution toward solving that problem. So there's a lot of different narratives for why we would be entrepreneurs. Some of them is, I want to be my own boss. I want the flexibility. Some people say they want to change the world by being an entrepreneur. I want to become a billionaire, whatever it is. But fundamentally, I think some of the best entrepreneurs and some of the people who lead the best, most robust careers, they have a long obedience toward focusing on a major problem that they care about solving. But you can't make you can't like do anything about that unless you actually have a skill set that can contribute to somehow solving that problem. So you might be really passionate about the problem of modern day slavery and human trafficking, but let's say you're really good at marketing, and you might not see the connection of those things. Well, guess what? Organizations that are out there trying to fight human trafficking, they need to be able to market themselves better.
Right. Yeah.
They need better branding. They need design, all of that kind of stuff for their own website. Also, if you have a deep understanding of marketing, you understand the ideas of supply and demand and sales, and ultimately supply and demand and sales fuels the demand side of human trafficking. So you can understand the problem of human trafficking at new levels because you've developed a skill set and you've studied marketing. And when I say studied, like, I mean, maybe you studied it in school, but more importantly, you're out in the marketplace gaining expertise and learning from the best of the best in that field and refining your own skill set. But you don't just have to do that in your day job. You can maybe spend some of your nights and evenings helping a nonprofit that's working on the thing that you care about. There's a lot of different ways to think about this, but you need to develop a skill set in order to make a meaningful contribution on a problem. And that problem might not be primarily in your day job, but you need to find a way to connect it. And I think that's where some of the creativity that we talk about comes in, is get creative in the ways that you apply and look for the intersection between the problem you care about and the skill set that you have, or the field that you're working in.
That's really good. I think skill sets too, as you think about, maybe it was because of college experience, but it's also something, whether it is a college experience or post-college or whatever that looks like, it's very intentional to get there. So $1 million question here, all the consultants in the world will be reaching out. What are some of those key skills as you think about kind of next generation leaders, emerging leaders, podcast listeners? If you could say, hey, here are 1 or 2 or 3 skills that I see routinely needed, and if you're going to be intentional with your time to spend in development of that, here are a couple of things that come to mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And, you know, the sort of pace at which things are changing in the world today, I think that 2 of the most important skills any of us can build are the ability to problem solve, and a practical way of doing that is through design thinking. So ability to problem solve, the skill set and the realm that I would learn a lot about is in design thinking.
Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, so design thinking, or it's called either human-centered design or design thinking. There's a ton of resources that exist online from firms like IDEO that can help train you in what design thinking is. But it's essentially this idea that we're trying to understand a problem and then solve that problem for real people. So a really famous case of design thinking is, this was like many years ago. It's on IDEO's website. I was looking at it yesterday. But 60 Minutes came and did a case study on these guys, and they basically put before them the shopping cart and helped. They said, okay, here's a basic item that gets used millions of times a day. Design a better shopping cart. And you get to watch them think through all of the different problems related to shopping carts and then try to solve for designing a better shopping cart. But the thing that they do really well first is one of the first steps of design thinking is empathy. So in empathy, you really do your best to put yourself in the shoes of a user and try to understand everything that you can around the problem. So one of the things that came out right away is they looked at the number of accidents that are reported every year related to shopping carts. And it's like an astonishing number of accidents that happen every year related to shopping carts. So once they had that statistic, they now know, okay, that's something that we should solve for when we get to the design phase. But they don't start with, let's solve the problem right away. The first step is, let's understand the problem before we can work toward solving it. And we need to develop a really deep understanding of the problem through empathy, which is, empathy in and of itself is kind of a skill set to learn how to build.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And all the moms are like, I can tell you where to start on that shopping cart.
Exactly right. But how many times in
But
like the corporate innovation world would somebody hey, design us a new shopping cart, and they start with, oh, let's come up with a really cool design, and they forget to go through the first step, which is let's actually study people that maybe they love the current shopping cart and don't want it to change, but let's study people that hate it. Let's try to really do everything we can to understand uh, the thing and what are all the different problems that are at play when it comes to that object.
yeah, so good. We are going to include all of the show notes. I've been taking a couple of notes here, Jon, around Praxis Academy for the fellows and not the fellas, and we'll be sure to include any links today that you share with us, especially around design thinking. So I'll do my homework there and make sure that that correlates with what you share with us today. We appreciate your time, and we love to ask every guest that comes on two questions. And the first one is we would love for you to make a shout out to someone or a group of people that you just want to publicly recognize and say thank you to.
Oh man, a shout out. There's so many people to give shout outs to. Um, um, I'm gonna give a shout out to a mentor of mine, a guy named Steve Garber. He's been instrumental in the way that I think and been really intentional about mentoring me. So that's my shout out, a guy named Steve Garber.
Okay. Okay, cool. And we would love to hear from you today too, a game changer. So it can be anything under the sun, but recent or maybe a few years ago, but something that sent your path in a little bit of a different direction for you.
Yeah, Kirby, I would say I couldn't answer the game changer question without telling a little bit of a story about the major turning point in my career. And it came actually after going through a season where I thought everything was coming together in my life. I kind of had sort of the American dream and the quote unquote Christian version of the American dream in my mind that I had been largely pursuing. It was a really good job. I was about to, I thought, get promoted. I had a lady that I was interested in. I had been dating her for a while. I thought we were going to get married and, do all that stuff. And kind of had a, really great community and church and all of that stuff that I was a part of in New York City. And I was kind of just living the dream. And then it all sort of came tumbling down within a week. A couple of tragic things happened. And I quickly learned that my faith was built really on that God delivering that dream for me that I had dreamt up in my mind. I kind of went through a really difficult season, a lot of doubting God, and my faith was sort of being tested. And I realized that my faith was kind of based on really the wrong things. And I, quite frankly, went through a significant season of depression. I didn't have a name for it at the time, but I just really had a hard time waking up in the morning. I had a hard time making decisions. I felt sad all the time. And I felt sad because one of the reasons why is I lost a really close friend of mine. He passed away at a very young age through a tragic circumstance, and had a relationship breakup, and that was sad. So there was an element of just me being sad, but there was a deeper element of my faith, something that was a foundation of my life, all of a sudden was almost non-existent. And that also made me feel sad. And so I went through a significant period of depression, felt a ton of anxiety all the time. And just prayed one of the most desperate prayers of my life during that season. And that was, God, if you're real, you need to help me. You need to help me get out of this somehow. I don't know what to do. For the first time in my life, I really do not know what to do about this. I can't get rid of this thing. I can't solve this problem. And God very clearly answered that prayer. He that day put a book on my mind that a friend of mine had suggested I read, and the book was just about grace and love and forgiveness and a whole bunch of different things. But it really framed the gospel and my relationship to God in a whole new way. And the Holy Spirit did some radical work in my life that day and just sent me in a whole new direction. And I would say, just for any listeners that have wrestled with depression or anxiety, I think it's a very real thing. And, part of the way this story could wrap up is me saying like, oh, and my life changed and it's all been better and it's perfect and all of that. But I'm pretty frank. I'm pretty real, and I like to actually talk about that depression's still a real thing, and I like to actually have open conversations about it. So, in part, the game changer for me was this hard season that I went through, experiencing depression for the first time, experiencing some freedom for it. But another game changer for me is over the long haul, in the 7 years since that major turning point in my life. I've realized that, this is just something that a lot of people deal with. And one way to make it better is to actually talk openly about it instead of try to hide it or veil it behind this idea that, hey, as a Christian, we're always supposed to be happy and joyful, and we're supposed to have faith and not doubt. So we should always just be happy, and being happy helps us put the depression away. It's like it's really not that simple. It's not that simple at all. So that is a game changer for me, being able to talk more openly about the idea depression, and talk with other people about it, be able to share on a podcast. I mean, you and I don't know each other, and I'm talking openly about it. I think that's important to do, because that helps me in my own ongoing battle in different seasons with depression.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks for sharing that with us and with me here. I'm sitting here with you today. I would ask, how would you say, like, practically speaking, how did friends in your community, coworkers, whatever that looks like, really love you during that season, like actionably, not just say it, right? But and how do you approach a conversation? You mentioned that one of the most beneficial things was to have an open dialogue. Where if you're being a good friend to someone, a good coworker, what could that look like? If you can just kind of walk us through practically, because I can imagine our audience is like, yes, thank you. Where do I start, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, one thing that I'd say is one thing not to do if a friend is going through that is to kind of give what often become cliche, cheap platitudes of, hey, God had a purpose for it, God had a reason for it, everything's going to be okay, it's okay, things like that. Those things might actually be true in the grand scheme of God's grand narrative, but they just get really cheapened out when we use them to try and fix somebody. So some of my most valuable friendships at the time knew how to sit with me and just listen, not try to solve or fix or throw some scripture at me, but they knew when to just listen and hear me out. They knew when something was off and knew how to just invite themselves to come over, because of course when you're going through something like that, you don't want to invite people over and invite people in. So I think that's one role as friends. Like, we need to be attentive. I saw a bunch of stuff on the internet about this in the last year, as we've seen some prominent suicides and things where people say, hey, reach out to me if you're ever thinking about something like that, or if you're depressed, just reach out. I'm one of your friends that you can talk to. Well, I saw somebody comment, and they just said, listen, when I'm depressed, I do not want to reach out to anybody. And I think that that's true. So I think our role is to pay really careful attention to our friends and to just stay in touch and figure out how to reach out to them, and offer to just be with them, not just solve their problems. So I think that's a big one.
Yeah. Thank you. That was really helpful. Well, I do appreciate your time. It was such a pleasure getting to know you and to hear not only about the work of Praxis, but what gets I guess what really kind of moved the needle in terms of the redemptive work, and you sharing some stories around that. So thanks for joining us. Again, like I said, for our listeners, we'll be sure to include links to the programs and anything that we talked about today, Jon. But again, thank you for sharing with us today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.